Hello everyone. This video is an initiative of IIT Delhi to provide information on the subject of climate change. Climate change is a subject of global concern and requires significant efforts from our side as well as from everyone's side to reduce it, to fight against it. It's a privilege to have Professor Krishna AchutaRao with us to provide an insight onto this issue. Professor AchutaRao has worked with several organizations on climate change, which include IPCC, the International Panel or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is world's leading organization dedicated to provide scientific information to the world to understand the risk of climate change and its impact all over and possible response options. He is also a member of American Geophysical Union, Indian Meteorological Society, and Ocean Society of India. He is currently working as professor in Department of Atmospheric Sciences at IIT Delhi. Sir, these days people are not much concerned about climate change, and that is going to be a big disaster in some of the following years due to lack of maybe proper information. So sir, what is climate change and what effects does it have on an ordinary person in everyday life?
So climate change is essentially, at least the modern climate change, is caused by greenhouse gas emissions that humankind has put out. In addition to greenhouse gases, we've also polluted the air with various kinds of aerosols. So these emissions have a combined effect of trapping heat within the Earth's atmosphere. So because of this added heat, the added energy in the atmosphere, we have an increase in global temperatures. Now, when you increase global temperatures, what it does is has secondary sort of effects, things like more evaporation of water, melting of ice. So all of these things combine together to change not just our temperature, but overall climate that we experience. So the climate that we experience is now quite different from what it was before the start of the Industrial Revolution, when most of these greenhouse gases started being emitted in large quantities. So what we as individuals experience, therefore, are the consequences of these changes in not just the temperature, but the rainfall and the humidity, the winds, the availability of water in our rivers. All of these are consequences of a changing climate. So there's hardly anybody that is not experiencing this changed climate. So as you know, climate is one of the major things that we rely on when we as societies build and go about our activities, all the way from food production to the way we live, the kind of housing that we build. Everything is suited to the climate that we live in. Now, if that's changing, it changes everything that we do as a society. How we grow our food, what kinds of food that we can grow, what kinds of systems are affected, economic, health, all of these are affected because of a changing climate.
So today, nowadays, many international organizations have come up to fight against the climate change. What are the steps the global community is taking to fight for this cause?
So the international community has been organized since at least 1992, when the Rio Summit happened. So since then, there's been a mechanism called the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, under which the global community has coalesced. So that process has been ongoing now, nearly 30 years. So in 2015, this global community came to another agreement. There were a few agreements prior to this. This agreement, called the Paris Accords, actually was a substantial agreement in the sense that the community, global community, came together and agreed that they should work towards keeping climate change to under 2 degrees centigrade, and if possible under 1.5 degree centigrade change in global temperatures. So this is a milestone accord. Now, as part of that accord, there are many actions that are required. Individual countries are required to submit voluntarily their nationally determined contributions in terms of what steps they will take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is one of the key things of the accord. And many countries, most countries in fact, have given their nationally determined contributions to reductions in greenhouse gases. So this, I would say, is a first step towards actually reversing climate change, or at least going towards stabilizing the climate of the planet.
So, since the fight against climate change has started, has the situation improved?
So we have to understand that this is really, as I said, a first step, right? The fact that people could agree to something. Now it turns out that every country that pledged we will do this, we will take these steps, has resulted in some what we would call steps towards reduction of greenhouse gases. But if you look at the sum total of what these pledges are, we will not be able to keep climate change under 2 degrees centigrade. It's going to be more like 3 degrees centigrade. So there's clearly more room for pledges and commitments to be made in terms of reductions of greenhouse gases. So this is still a work in progress. So the hope is that in these annual conference of parties, as they are called, the COP sessions, countries will come together and raise their commitments, increase their commitments to reduction, so that this goal of 2 degrees C at the most, and possibly even 1.5, is actually reached.
Apart from launching awareness campaigns, how can organizations working against climate change make their fight more effective?
So, as I've explained, this whether somebody has information is the first step, the right information, that is. We've already addressed this question of some people being fed misinformation. So information, giving people the correct scientific latest information, is a key part of all of this. Awareness is step one. After that, how do you get them to be using that awareness? That is where I think we all have a role to play. Because if I'm aware of something and do nothing about it, it's not of much use. But if I'm aware of the situation, and I, as a person, as an individual or as an organization, if I think here is where I can contribute, right? So, for example, as engineering students here at IIT, you are trained in engineering and technology, the latest science. So you have a domain knowledge, and you're going to be out there in the world working with industry and government. And if you're aware of this problem, your job is to make sure that this awareness, this knowledge that you have, is incorporated in your day-to-day life. So if you go into an industry, this awareness of climate change should be carried into that, whether you can contribute there. Now, if you talk of um, students in other places. There are students even at IIT who are not in the engineering stream. There are people who do the humanities and social sciences and pure sciences. So even for them, there's, because the climate change is not just about putting new technology out there, right? It is also working with people so that they take up the technology, for which you need to understand how human beings behave. You need to be able to inform policymakers, government people, and industry people. How do you design economic and other instruments so that whatever changes need to happen, that they are taken into account, that climate change is a factor that's taken into consideration in making those decisions. So you, as an organization, may want to get involved in advocacy. Pick one or two things where you can actually contribute, not just in terms of your expertise, but also in terms of access to expertise. Because no one organization will have full expertise. So, but if you're, let's say you pick something, let's say you say, we're going to push for electric buses, public transport to become more widespread, and low carbon public transport or zero emission public transport to become more. So what is involved? How do you make sure that buses get preference over cars in the city streets? How do you figure out how to charge so many bus batteries every day, and how do you get them to run in the cities? So there's, even if you take a simple little part of the puzzle, there are so many details and intricacies that you can get into. So there's a role for pushing for policy, making sure that the government is paying attention to these problems, and not allowing the, because especially in India, this is a very critical time in our history, because we are a developing country poised to take off. Most of our development hasn't happened yet, in spite of what you might see in the, the malls and whatnot. And most of our development is yet to happen. So in that development, how are you going to make sure that you're not making the same mistakes, the same high emission mistakes that the rest of the developed world has made? So there's a role here to make sure that you're not compromising on one thing because you are looking for another thing. These are both important. Development is critically important, but so is making sure that India should be able to leapfrog. What are the ways in which you can skip one or two of these dirty technologies and go past it? So this is where I think, even if you're just an individual citizen, you can actually make an impact in making sure that those goals are met, that you understand the complexity of the problem, but still work towards it.
So basically, we all need to understand our duties, and we all need to contribute towards the climate change from whatever source we can.
Right. Whether you call it a duty, or you can also look at it as a right, because I'm of the generation that probably contributed to a lot of the problem. Right. Now, I think it should be a right for every person to be living in a safe climate where they're not exposed to the kinds of hazards that climate change can bring. So our responsibility is to make sure that we're not just doing it for ourselves, but for people who are going to come after. There are future generations that have more at stake. Your generation and the generations in the future have more at stake here. So the earlier this is actually dealt with, it's better. So in a sense, it's a responsibility to the to the future generations that I feel is an important thing to consider.
So, what changes can an ordinary person bring in his lifestyle to contribute to the cause?
Right. So this is an important question, and there's actually a lot of debate. A lot of people have made substantive changes in their lifestyle, right? So whether you own a car, whether you drive a car, what kind of car you drive, or how you use your air conditioning, or whether you use air conditioning, or you say I'm going to work with a desert cooler, whatever it might be. So there's many choices, at least for some of us. Some people don't have choices; they are left to suffer the consequences. But each one of us can do many things, little things. Whether it is the kind of food that we eat, or the kind of public transport that we use, the kind of car that we drive, scooter, whatever that we drive, all of these things are individual choices, and we have those. But let's not fool ourselves. This is beyond what individual contributions can do. This is too large a problem to not be addressed at the government level. So while we make our individual choices, and certainly if everybody stops buying these big SUV type cars, right? So if you go out instead and buy a fuel efficient car, much more fuel efficient, or hopefully a solar powered, battery charged electric vehicle with very little emission, almost zero. These are choices, but as individuals, as consumers, if you make these choices towards those, hopefully the business community sees that and sees where the demand is and pushes those demands. But that is a very slow process, and that depends on all of us making the right choices, which we know doesn't happen very easily, at least. So our best bet is to still affect things at policy level. If the government pushes certain policies, certain things will happen easier than if we as individuals and our consumer choices aiming to push those. Right? The market moves based on what the policy world says. If the government policy is encouraging electric vehicles and discouraging fossil fuel vehicles, then that will have a larger effect than you or me or somebody else going out and buying a single EV. Okay? So we have to understand that even that, pushing the government, is a personal choice. It's an individual's choice that you get involved in the political process. By political process, I don't mean the going campaigning, electioning, but I mean in the policy world, in the politics of how these decisions are made, as consumers, as citizens, as people with the problem of climate change in mind, we have to strive for that.
Sir, any specific message you want to give to us?
Well, I think as IIT students, you are uniquely poised in many ways. Many of you will go on and work in industry and government, as I've said before, and I know from the fact that many of you will be going high up into industry and government echelons, the decision making, the power centers of these bodies. You're also likely to take up research and study the problem more, and I encourage you to get informed about this problem, because you're uniquely positioned to actually make a difference, whichever path you choose. So I think as industry leaders, as future leaders of the society, you have a unique role to play in making sure that your awareness doesn't stay within yourself and that you actually apply that to the problem. problems that you will encounter.
Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us on this topic. Thank you all. We at NSS try that everyone should have an understanding of what actually the subject of climate change is, and we all should make some effort to do something for climate change, because we have to do something for our planet. Nobody is going to do magically everything for us. Thank you.